The story of Superman has become a trope in itself. These days, the idea of an all-powerful being capable of superior feats has become a common narrative, especially thanks to the continuous popularity of the superhero genre. But often that trope can be subverted and twisted, giving us much darker versions of that Superman character. Today, we are returning to a list that examined that very trope, our top 10 scary alternate Superman stories, coming at you with a part 2. So this time around, rather than just focusing on stories outside of DC's realm that feature a Superman-esque character, we're also going to be looking at a few Elseworld and alternate Earth titles that stray a lot from the regular Superman narrative. With that in mind, let's get to it. In at number 10, Samaritan. Starting off our list, we have a character from the comic series Astro City. The Samaritan has been compared both to Superman and Captain Marvel. He has superhuman strength, can manipulate energy fields, is capable of hypersonic flight, has enhanced senses, and has pulled off interdimensional travel too. So how is he a tragic version of the Man of Steel? Because his mind is that of a weary and worn time traveler who comes from a dystopian future timeline set in the 35th century. He was chosen to be sent back in time to prevent a catastrophic event that completely ruined the future. Sent back in 1985, the Samaritan encounters an Empyrean fire, which was the strands of energy that made up time itself. They fused with his body, altering him. He does manage to alter the event that he was sent back to change, saving the space shuttle the Challenger from disaster, and eventually becomes a superhero using his powers for good. But that takes a toll on his mental health, causing him great stress. And when he does time travel back to his era, he learns that by saving the Challenger, he did save the future, but also created a future in which he ceased to exist, meaning he could never really return home. And at number 9, Arch Enemies. Arch Enemies is the story of two roommates who have no idea that the other is actually a superpowered individual, and turns out they're each other's arch enemy. Hence the title. The Superman in this case is a fella named Starfighter, Ethan Baxter, who is a handsome, buff dude, but is also a complete slob, loves to party, and controls something called stellar energy, which allows him to fly and project energy among other talents. Vincent Darko, his roommate, is the villain Underlord. The two are horrible roommates to one another, with Ethan throwing parties solely to piss Vincent off, with Vincent hating Ethan more than he could ever possibly hate his Starfighter alter ego. I mean, it's not as scary as some of the other entries on our list, but the idea of a slobby Superman character who is just an overall asshole, that's not the greatest way a Superman character could be depicted. Getting into some thicker territory here at number 8, the Ubermensch. Now for this number, we're diving into some philosophy. Back in 1883, Friedrich Nietzsche published a book called Thus Spoke Zarathustra, in which he elaborated on an ethical idea of his known as the Ubermensch, which translates into the superhuman in German, or Superman. The idea was that the Ubermensch is a goal for humanity to set for itself, and that God is dead. God being a concept that gave meaning to life. With that understanding, there is a danger of nihilism overwhelming humanity unless we look to the Ubermensch, the perfect example of the kinds of values humankind should strive for, a bar that is set that is ideal for us. Now, he also said that the ultimate aspiration for a woman would be to give birth to an Ubermensch, which is no bueno, but this was conceived in the 19th century after all. Anywho, the Ubermensch philosophy has become a trope of sorts apparent in a lot of different kinds of media, in which we see an idealized Superman-esque character who attempts to give others meaning in their lives or hope. Yet that trope is often twisted, with the Ubermensch character causing more chaos and destruction in the process. Take a look at Tyler Durden from Fight Club, for example, or both Batman and the Joker from Christopher Nolan's The Dark Knight, the latter being an example of two completely different kinds of Ubermensch. While Nietzsche's philosophy predates DC's Superman by around half a century, the concept is still often associated with the Man of Steel, and we constantly see its impact today in modern stories. Moving on to something a little lighter, in at number 7, Superman Red Sun. The concept behind Superman Red Sun is, what if Superman had landed in the Soviet Union and was raised there? Well, the answer to that is a very different version of Kal-El. A 3-issue prestige format miniseries from DC, Red Sun, which won an Eisner Award in 2004 might I add, has Superman's rocket ship land in the Ukraine, on a collective farm, and he is raised as a champion of the common worker who fights a never-ending battle for Stalin, socialism, and the international expansion of the Warsaw Pact. It's a story world in which the Cold War is concerned with superhumans rather than a nuclear arms race. Superman becomes a Big Brother-esque figure for the Soviet Union, and because of his influence, the Soviet Union has nearly expanded to all parts of the globe by 1978, with the US on the verge of collapse. An introduction of a brain surgery technique turns dissidents into obedient followers known as Superman robots. And Lex Luthor is the President of the United States, constantly coming up with schemes to defeat the threat the Man of Steel poses. Oh, and Batman also exists in this universe too, but as a freedom fighter vigilante of sorts, of course. Up next at 6, Injustice's Superman. The Injustice Superman is one of the most grim takes on the hero from DC. His backstory is similar to the main continuities but diverts after Metropolis has been destroyed by a nuclear blast, and the Joker has manipulated Superman into killing Lois Lane and his unborn child in the process. As Batman and Superman interrogate the Joker, the Clown Prince of Crime presses Superman's buttons, toying and taunting with him, with Superman finally leaning into his rage, eventually snapping and punching a hole through the Joker's chest, which obviously killed him, despite Batman's attempts to intervene. From there, Superman decides that the only way to eliminate crime is to have absolute power over the Earth, which begins a tyrannical regime in which like-minded superpowered individuals, both heroes and villains, work as Superman's generals enforcing his laws. Because apparently humans can't enforce it well enough, according to his logic. Up next, number 5, Dr. Manhattan. Dr. Manhattan from Watchmen may seem like a wee bit of a stretch here on this list, but hear us out. Dr. Manhattan is the only superhero in the Watchmen universe that has powers, and also worth noting for the purpose of this number, we are looking specifically at Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' Watchmen stories, not any of that new Doomsday Clock stuff. So, Dr. Manhattan, once known as John Osterman, became a near-omnipotent superpowered individual after the nuclear physicist was trapped in an intrinsic field subtractor in 1959, which reconstructed him on a molecular level, granting him his abilities. After being reanimated, he was immediately put into the service of the US government, and was asked by Nixon later on to intervene in the Vietnam War, where the opposition saw him as a literal god. That's because he has unlimited manipulation of his own body and matter in general, subatomic perception and control, invulnerability, and clairvoyance. Gradually over time, he loses touch with humanity, unable to empathize with them. He is seen as a post-human god, and according to his colleague Wally Weaver, I quote, "I never said the Superman exists and he's American. What I said was God exists and he's American." Now, in the events of Watchmen, Dr. Manhattan is framed by Adrian Veidt in order to create distrust towards the character and prevent him from seeing through Veidt's plan to put an end to the energy crisis and create world peace, through pretty nefarious means. Later though, in that Doomsday Clock series, Manhattan is portrayed as a villain, and comes to the conclusion that he is a being of inaction on a collision course with a man of action, that man being Superman. Up next, number 4, Ultraman. Ultraman is a Superman alternate from DC who hails from an alternate Earth in which the Justice League's counterparts are all villains. Initially from Earth 3, Ultraman is a villainous version of Superman who gets stronger every time that he is exposed to kryptonite, and initially developed a new superpower ability every time that he was near it. One of those powers allowed him to see through dimensional barriers, which is how the Crime Syndicate, the evil version of the Justice League, learned of other Earth's existences. Luckily, he does have a weakness to yellow sunlight, something revealed post New 52, with the direct sunlight breaking down his kryptonite radiation. Up next at 3, Astonish Man from the N-League. Astonish Man is considered the world's greatest superhero in the N-League series, a Dark Horse bi-monthly comic that ran from January 2008 to October 2009. It's a story in which supervillains have prevailed, and the remaining superheroes struggle to fight for a world that has largely been enslaved. Astonish Man, also known as Brian Terrence, was over 100 years old and blamed himself for what had happened. That's because in 1962, Astonish Man triggered a worldwide cataclysm which would be known as the Green Event, after he was tricked into believing that a communist nuclear factory was at the bottom of the sea. He detonated a nuclear missile into this facility, which actually turned out to be an alien spaceship, and caused a wave of radiation to knock the Earth off of its axis, killing 3 billion people in the process and causing 1 in 10,000 survivors to develop superpowers thanks to the radiation. It only gets worse from there. We learned that Astonish Man had been drawing energy from the Earth's core, and when his skin was broken, that energy that gave him his powers leaked out of his body, and when he died, that energy left his body entirely, in a blast of nuclear proportions. Moving on to number 2, Sentry. Sentry has often been called Marvel's Superman equivalent. A character who first appeared in 2000, he's described as a hero with the power of 1 million exploding suns, and is capable of feats beyond DC's Man of Steel's own abilities. Sentry has super strength, speed, stamina, regenerative healing factor, can manipulate light, is completely invulnerable, has psionic powers, he can fly, has enhanced senses, is capable of molecular manipulation, weather and gravity manipulation, matter manipulation, can absorb or project energy, he's immortal, can teleport and use astral projection, he can shapeshift, bend time, project thoughts, is telepathic, and can even become invisible. Yeah, it's a lot of stuff. Aside from having an awesome level of power, it's his story that lands him on this list. When we first meet the character in his alter ego form, Robert Reynolds, he has started to recall memories of Sentry and his nemesis, the Void, and soon discovers that he has been wiped from the minds and memories of all of the other superheroes in the Marvel Universe, along with the public. Reed Richards and Dr. Doom helped erase his and everyone else's memories as a means of keeping the Void at bay. That's because the Void is Sentry's other half, a nefarious villain that lives within Reynolds, a dark side effect of his power powers. The reason why Void exists within him has changed over the years too. Sometimes it's because of an innate division between good and evil within Reynolds. Other times it's thanks to a mind virus placed within him, and so on. But regardless, he's a twist on the concept of Superman in a way that makes his ultimate powers more complex, and allows for a new character dynamic that readers found themselves quickly invested in. And finally, in at number 1, Super Shock from Powers. Super Shock comes from a comic series called Powers, a story told from the perspective of a homicide cop who has to navigate a world where superpowered individuals reign and fight off flamboyant villains. Super Shock first shows up 22 issues into the series, and is a high-level power being the name for those with superpowered abilities. Active since World War I, the character would eventually become insane, becoming destructive and going on a rampage that inevitably caused his own death. With their Justice League-esque team Unity slowly becoming corrupted and falling to shambles, Super Shock began asking himself why he was serving humans when they were inferior creatures to him. Or does that sound familiar? Rather than being useful to them, he wanted them to serve him as if he were their king. He began acting irrationally, first murdering one of his Unity teammates, a hero by the name of Red Hawk, who Super Shock publicly exposed as a pedophile, then killed. He began intervening in political issues including the war between Israel and Palestine, which he put an end to by vaporizing the entire area. Then he flew over to Rome and melted the Pope, wanting to be the only godly figure on the planet. When the rest of the world's powers and legal authorities began to hunt him for this, he pulled a particularly gruesome stunt. He ended up taking a police officer up into space, killed her, then resurrected her, then killed her again, and then repeated the process over and over and over again to the point where he even ripped out her own heart and showed it to her. His whole point being to show the world how he had complete control over the life and death of humans. Talk about dark. Alright, there we have it, friends. What other alternate erroneous Superman stories can you think of, both outside of DC and from the publisher? Give us a shout in those comments below and let us know. If you dug this video, you guys know what to do. Hit that like button and spread the love. And be sure to subscribe to Top 10 Nerd if you want more lists just like this one. In the meantime though, thanks for watching. I'll catch you all in the next video.